Evelyn Thompson was a pillar of her community. At 78 years old, she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had weathered life's storms and come out stronger. Known for her warm smile and unshakable faith, she had spent the morning at church leading a Bible study. As she walked home that afternoon, her pace was unhurried, her thoughts on the scriptures she had just shared. Her neighborhood was usually quiet at that time of day, with children still at school and most adults at work. The streets were lined with familiar houses and shops where she was greeted warmly by name. But as she passed a narrow alley, the peace was abruptly shattered. A man darted out from the shadows. A young white man, mid-20s, with a scruffy hoodie and an air of desperation. Without a word, he grabbed the strap of Evelyn's handbag and yanked it hard. The force sent Evelyn stumbling backward, and she fell to the pavement, her Bible skidding across the ground. The man didn't stop to look back. Clutching her handbag, he disappeared down the alley, leaving Evelyn sprawled on the sidewalk, shaken and bruised. People nearby rushed to her aid, some helping her to her feet while others looked down the alley, reluctant to give chase. "Are you all right, Mrs. Thompson?" one woman asked, her voice filled with concern. Evelyn nodded, her hands trembling as she clutched her Bible, but her voice wavered as she replied, "I'll be fine, thank you." The incident left a mark deeper than the physical bruises on Evelyn's arms. It wasn't just the loss of her handbag. It was the suddenness, the disrespect, the way she was targeted. In that moment, she felt an unspoken insult to the sense of safety and respect she had spent a lifetime nurturing in her community. What the robber didn't know was that Evelyn's son, Marcus Thompson, was not only a devoted son, but also the chief of police. For Marcus, justice wasn't just a job. It was a calling, a way to honor his mother's values and protect others like her. Evelyn called Marcus shortly after returning home, her voice calm but tinged with exhaustion. "Marcus, someone took my bag," she said simply, recounting the incident with more grace than anger. Marcus felt a storm of emotions, anger at the violation, concern for his mother, and an intense determination to make things right. "Mama," he said, gripping the phone tightly, "I'll handle it. Don't you worry." What neither Evelyn nor Marcus fully realized at that moment was how this personal incident would become a flashpoint. It wasn't just about a stolen handbag. It was about something larger, about respect, accountability, and the delicate threads that hold a community together. Marcus Thompson wasn't just a law enforcement officer. He was a leader, known for his unwavering commitment to fairness and accountability. The moment he heard his mother's voice on the phone, describing what had happened, he knew this wasn't just another case, it was personal. However, personal didn't mean reckless. Marcus approached the situation with the same measured professionalism he applied to every case, though the stakes felt much higher. The first step was to gather evidence. Marcus sent a team to the scene to interview witnesses and collect surveillance footage. The neighborhood, where his mother had lived for decades, had plenty of people willing to help. Several shop owners offered camera recordings, and a handful of passers-by described the suspect. Soon Marcus and his team had a lead, a young man named Dylan Walsh, known to the police for previous petty crimes. But despite the clear evidence and swift identification, Marcus encountered unexpected delays in bringing Dylan into custody. Some officers on his team didn't seem to share his sense of urgency. "It's just a snatch and grab," one of them remarked dismissively during a briefing. "We've got bigger things to deal with." Marcus felt a knot tighten in his chest. He wasn't just dealing with a criminal. He was navigating a system that often downplayed incidents like this, especially when the victims were seen as less important. But to Marcus, there was no hierarchy of justice. His mother and anyone else in her position deserved the same level of respect and urgency as any other victim. The delays weren't just procedural. They began to spark frustration in the community. Word of the incident spread quickly. Evelyn Thompson wasn't just anyone. She was beloved by her neighbors, a mentor to many, and a symbol of dignity and resilience. People began to ask questions. Why hadn't the suspect been arrested yet? Why was this case being treated as if it didn't matter? Conversations bubbled with a quiet tension, and some of those murmurs reached the media. For Marcus, this wasn't just about resolving the case, it was about restoring trust. He called a meeting with his team, laying out his expectations clearly. "This isn't just about my mother," he said firmly. "This is about sending a message that we protect everyone, no matter who they are. I want Dylan Walsh in custody by the end of the day." Meanwhile, Marcus kept a close eye on his mother, who tried to downplay the ordeal. Evelyn had always been the kind of person who didn't want to burden others. But Marcus knew her well enough to see the subtle changes in her demeanor. The hesitation before she went outside, the way her hands lingered on the doorframe before stepping out. When Dylan Walsh was finally arrested, Marcus thought the hard part was over. But he was wrong. Dylan's family, well-connected and eager to shield him from consequences, hired a prominent attorney who immediately framed the incident as a minor misunderstanding. The narrative began to shift, with some questioning whether the case warranted such attention. Marcus's resolve only deepened. He knew that justice wasn't just about catching the suspect. It was about ensuring the process wasn't undermined by those who viewed certain lives as less important. The fight was far from over, but Marcus was determined to see it through. For his mother, for the community, for the principles he had sworn to uphold. With Dylan Walsh in custody, the case moved into the next phase: prosecution. For Marcus, the arrest was only the beginning. The legal battle ahead would determine not just whether Dylan would be held accountable, but whether Evelyn's dignity, and by extension the community's faith in justice, would be restored. Dylan's attorney wasted no time constructing a defense that painted his actions as impulsive and harmless. "He's just a young man who made a poor choice," the lawyer argued during the pretrial hearing. "There was no intent to harm anyone." The defense sought to downplay the incident, characterizing it as a mistake rather than a deliberate act of harm. But Marcus, the prosecutor, and the rest of Evelyn's supporters knew better. They prepared a meticulous case using the evidence to show the deliberate nature of the crime. Surveillance footage clearly showed Dylan waiting in the alley, observing Evelyn before making his move. Witness testimonies described the aggressive force he used to grab her bag and the lack of concern for her well-being as she fell. As the trial began, Evelyn sat in the courtroom, her presence a quiet but powerful reminder of what was at stake. Though frail in appearance, she radiated strength. Marcus stood by her side, his role as a son temporarily overtaking his duties as a law enforcement officer. "You don't have to do this if you don't want to, Mama," he had said earlier that morning. But Evelyn was resolute. "I'm not doing this just for me, Marcus. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do." When Evelyn took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. Her voice was calm but steady as she recounted the day of the robbery. "I've lived a long life," she began, "and I've seen my share of hard times. But what hurt most that day wasn't the loss of my bag. It was the way I was treated, like I didn't matter, like I was invisible." Her testimony struck a chord with the jury. The prosecution emphasized that this case wasn't just about theft, it was about holding individuals accountable for their actions and ensuring that such acts didn't go unchecked. The defense attempted to counter by leaning into Dylan's background, portraying him as a troubled youth from a good family who had simply strayed off course. They brought in character witnesses who spoke of his kindness and potential. But this argument rang hollow in the face of the evidence and the harm he had caused. Midway through the trial, Marcus began to notice something shifting in the courtroom. Dylan's demeanor, initially one of indifference, began to crack under the weight of the testimonies and evidence. He avoided looking at Evelyn, his face a mixture of shame and discomfort. Meanwhile, the jury's expressions reflected growing unease with the defense's attempts to minimize his actions. In closing arguments, the prosecutor spoke directly to the jury. "This case isn't just about what was taken from Mrs. Thompson. It's about recognizing that her pain, her experience, and her humanity deserve the same respect and justice as anyone else. Dylan Walsh made a choice that day. Now it's time for you to make one too." The jury deliberated for hours, and tension filled the courtroom as everyone awaited the verdict. Finally, the foreperson stood and announced the decision: guilty. Dylan was sentenced to prison time and mandatory community service, including work in Evelyn's neighborhood. For Marcus, the verdict was a victory, but it wasn't a moment for celebration. Instead, it was a reminder of how much work remained to ensure justice was truly equal and accessible to everyone. For Evelyn, the resolution brought a measure of peace, though she carried no bitterness. Weeks later, as Dylan began his community service, Evelyn surprised everyone by visiting him. "I'm not here to judge you," she told him. "I'm here to remind you that we all have the power to change, if we choose to." Her words left a lasting impact, not just on Dylan, but on everyone who heard her story. In a world often too quick to dismiss or diminish others, Evelyn's strength and grace shone as a beacon of what justice could and should look like. The day after the verdict, the local community gathered outside the courthouse. People came not just to celebrate the outcome, but to acknowledge what Evelyn represented: resilience, dignity, and the determination to stand up for what's right. Her story had struck a chord, inspiring neighbors to share their own experiences of feeling overlooked or unheard. Evelyn stood on the courthouse steps, addressing the crowd with the same calm strength that had guided her through the trial. "This wasn't just about me," she said, her voice steady. "It was about showing that we all matter, that when something wrong happens, we have the right to speak up and demand it be made right." Her words resonated deeply, and in the days that followed, conversations about fairness and community support grew louder. Local leaders began discussing ways to improve safety and trust within the neighborhood, spurred by the visibility of Evelyn's case. As part of his sentence, Dylan was required to complete community service in Evelyn's neighborhood. His first days were awkward and tense. People recognized him, and he felt the weight of their judgment. Evelyn, however, surprised everyone by showing up to one of his assignments at a community center. She approached him calmly, her presence as steady as ever. "You and I aren't so different," she said. Dylan looked at her, puzzled. "I've made my mistakes too," she continued. "We all have. What matters is what we do next." Her words marked a turning point for Dylan. Over time, he began to approach his community service, not as a punishment, but as an opportunity to give back. He started listening to the people around him, understanding the impact of his actions on Evelyn and others. Slowly, he earned back a measure of respect from the neighborhood, though the road to redemption was far from easy. For Marcus, the trial reinforced the importance of accountability, not just for individuals, but for the system as a whole. He used the case as a catalyst for reform within his department, holding meetings with his officers to address the deeper issues the case had brought to light. "We're here to protect and serve everyone," Marcus told his team during a briefing. "And that means treating every case, every person with the respect they deserve." Marcus also worked with local leaders to implement new community engagement programs, focusing on building trust and understanding between law enforcement and residents. He believed that the only way to prevent future incidents like the one his mother endured was to foster stronger connections and mutual respect. Months after the trial, Evelyn returned to her routine, her life seemingly unchanged. But those who knew her saw a renewed sense of purpose. She continued her work in the church, mentoring younger women and organizing community events. Her story had become a symbol of perseverance and the power of speaking up, and she embraced the role with humility. One evening, as she and Marcus sat on her porch, she reflected on everything that had happened. "You know, Marcus," she said, "I've lived long enough to see that justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about helping people find their way back to what's right." Marcus nodded, taking in her words. "You taught me that, Mama," he said, "and I'm going to do my best to carry it forward." Evelyn's case became more than a legal victory. It became a story of healing and hope. It showed how accountability, compassion, and determination could come together to create meaningful change. For Evelyn, Marcus, and even Dylan, the experience left an indelible mark, proving that justice is most powerful when it seeks not just to punish, but to uplift and restore. As the sun set over the neighborhood that had rallied around Evelyn, her house stood as a quiet reminder of the strength and unity that had carried her through. It wasn't just her victory. It was a testament to the community's collective power to demand fairness and find a path forward together. Evelyn, though back to her daily routine, felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had always been active in her community, but now she found herself in a unique position of influence. People came to her not only for comfort and guidance, but to share their own struggles and fears, inspired by her courage to speak up. At church, she started hosting a new discussion group called Paths to Peace, where people could openly talk about their experiences and explore ways to strengthen their community. "We all carry our burdens," she would say, "but when we share them, they get lighter." One day, a young mother approached her after the group. "Mrs. Thompson," she said hesitantly, "I've been afraid to walk my daughter to school ever since what happened to you. But seeing you stand so strong, it gives me hope." Evelyn smiled warmly, taking the woman's hand. "Hope is something we give each other, dear. And you've just given it back to me." For Marcus, the case reinforced the importance of leadership and accountability within the justice system. He recognized that while the legal outcome of his mother's case was just, there were still larger systemic challenges that needed addressing to prevent similar incidents in the future. Working with city officials, Marcus spearheaded a new community outreach initiative aimed at fostering dialogue between law enforcement and residents. The program included town hall meetings, open-door policies at the precinct, and a mentorship program for local youth interested in careers in public service. During one of the first town halls, Marcus stood before a packed community center. "My job," he said, "isn't just to enforce the law. It's to make sure everyone feels seen, heard, and valued. That's how we build trust, and that's how we create a safer, stronger community." The initiative was met with cautious optimism, but over time, more residents participated, sharing their concerns and ideas for change. Marcus listened intently, using their input to shape policies that reflected the community's needs. Dylan's mandatory community service was a pivotal experience, one that gradually reshaped his understanding of the harm he had caused. Spending time in Evelyn's neighborhood, he began to interact with the people whose lives he had indirectly affected. Each conversation deepened his awareness of how much his actions had disrupted the sense of safety and trust they had worked hard to maintain. One day, while working on repairs at the community center, he saw Evelyn approaching. He hesitated, unsure of how to face her, but she smiled gently and sat on a nearby bench. After a moment, she spoke. "Dylan," she began, "I don't expect you to undo what happened, but I do hope you'll use this time to think about what kind of man you want to be." Her words stayed with him. Over time, Dylan began volunteering beyond the scope of his sentence, helping with youth programs and assisting elderly residents with errands. Slowly, the neighborhood began to see him as more than the person who had wronged Evelyn. They saw him trying to make amends. Evelyn's story became a catalyst for the neighborhood to come together in ways it hadn't before. Block meetings became more frequent, with residents discussing ways to support one another and address shared concerns. Local businesses began contributing to community improvement projects, and a renewed sense of unity began to take root. One of the most significant changes came in the form of a new neighborhood watch program led by volunteers from all walks of life. Evelyn was invited to speak at its launch. "Safety isn't just about locking doors and watching cameras," she said. "It's about knowing your neighbors, looking out for one another, and believing in the good we can do together." As time went on, Evelyn's case was remembered not just for the crime itself, but for the way it brought people together. It became a story of resilience, accountability, and hope, proof that even in moments of pain and loss, there's room for growth and change. For Evelyn, the journey wasn't about being a symbol or a hero. It was about staying true to her values and showing her community that even the smallest acts of courage could inspire lasting change. And for Marcus, it reaffirmed his belief that leadership was as much about listening as it was about action. As the sun set on another quiet day in the neighborhood, Evelyn sat on her porch, looking out at the streets she had walked for so many years. She felt a sense of peace, knowing that her actions had not only helped her community heal, but had also planted seeds of hope for the future. Evelyn had always leaned on her faith during challenging times, and this situation was no different. In her quiet moments, she reflected on the teachings that had guided her throughout her life. She remembered the importance of forgiveness, not as a sign of weakness, but as a way to free herself from the burden of anger and bitterness. One Sunday after church, Evelyn addressed her Bible study group. "Forgiveness," she said, "is not about forgetting what someone has done. It's about remembering who you are and choosing not to let pain define you." Her words resonated with those around her, many of whom had carried their own wounds, some visible, others hidden. Evelyn's example reminded them that healing often begins with a choice, to let go of resentment and embrace hope. One morning, as Evelyn tended to the flowers in her garden, she noticed Dylan walking up the path. His shoulders were hunched, and he held a small bouquet of daisies in one hand. Evelyn set down her gardening tools and rose to meet him. She could see the nervousness in his posture, but she waited patiently for him to speak. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, his voice faltering, I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything, for hurting you and for all the pain I caused." Evelyn regarded him silently for a moment, then motioned for him to sit on the bench near her garden. "Dylan," she said gently, "apologies are the first step, but they're not the end of the journey. What matters now is what you do with your life moving forward." Dylan nodded, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I've been trying," he said quietly. "I want to do better." Evelyn placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's all any of us can do. Keep trying." Evelyn's garden, once a private retreat, became a gathering place for her neighbors. Inspired by her story, people began coming together for informal meetings and prayer groups, finding strength in shared faith and solidarity. Each gathering was a reminder that challenges could be met with collective resilience. During one of these gatherings, Marcus spoke about his mother's impact. "My mother taught me that faith isn't just about words, it's about action." And then, he said, "She's shown me that when we live according to our values, we can inspire others to do the same." The garden became a symbol of hope, its vibrant blooms a testament to the power of growth and renewal. Neighbors who had once been strangers now worked side by side, planting flowers and tending to the space. What had started as Evelyn's private sanctuary evolved into a shared expression of unity and faith. For Marcus, the experience deepened his understanding of what it meant to lead. Watching his mother navigate such a painful experience with grace and resolve reminded him that strength didn't always come from force. It often came from compassion. He began incorporating these lessons into his work, encouraging his team to engage more directly with the community. At one precinct meeting, he told his officers, "Justice isn't just about enforcing the law. It's about understanding the people we serve and meeting them where they are. My mother showed me that." His words inspired a shift in how his department approached their role. Officers started participating in local events, volunteering their time, and forging connections that transcended their uniforms. For Dylan, Evelyn's forgiveness was a turning point. It allowed him to stop running from his guilt and begin rebuilding his life. He started attending church and even joined some of the community gatherings in Evelyn's garden. Though he was far from erasing his mistakes, he found purpose in serving others. One day, as the sun set over the neighborhood, Dylan approached Evelyn after a gathering. "Thank you," he said simply, "for seeing something in me when I didn't see it in myself." Evelyn smiled. "We all have worth, Dylan. Sometimes it just takes someone else to remind us." As the seasons changed, so did the neighborhood. What had once been a place of quiet routines now buzzed with renewed energy and connection. Evelyn's story became more than just an account of hardship. It was a reminder of the strength that comes from faith, forgiveness, and community. For Evelyn, the journey wasn't about being remembered as a hero. It was about living in a way that honored her values and inspired others to do the same. Sitting on her porch one evening, she watched as children played in the street and neighbors greeted one another with warmth. It was a simple scene, but it filled her heart with peace. This, somebody thought, is what healing looks like. And for the neighborhood, for Dylan, and for Marcus, it was the beginning of a brighter, more united future.